This is the last lecture of period 1, and we're going to talk about how Europeans and Native Americans interact. So this is still key concept 1.2, contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans results in the Columbian Exchange, and there are a lot of changes on both sides of the Atlantic. We're talking about the interactions between Europeans and Native Americans and how they had divergent or differing worldviews regarding issues like religion, gender roles, family, land use, and power. So there were mutual misunderstandings, and we know this, between Europeans and Native Americans, and that's often defined the early years of interactions between these two groups, and it defines their trade relations. Each group tries to make sense of the other, and over time, Europeans and Native Americans adopt some useful aspects of each other's culture, but at first there's a lot of misunderstanding and strife. So the first issue is the idea of private versus public use of land, public meaning communal land use. Europeans believed in land ownership. They believed you paid taxes on land, that you could own property, that you could make profit on owning land. England actually offered land in the New World to anyone who was willing to cross the Atlantic and settle in America. Land in England or Europe was wealth. And Europeans, here's my biggest example, they built fences. That was unheard of in many Native American cultures. Native American groups, mostly, because again, we've talked about how unique each group is. Even within major groups like the Pueblo, there are so many varying aspects of clans or tribes. But mostly, Native American groups shared the concept of community-owned land. And again, big generalization. But the widespread belief is that no one technically owns land. Anyone who wants to live and grow crops on land can do so, and that each tribe was given this communal gift of this space, ancestral land. You could hunt on land for a while and then move on if you were nomadic, but there was no idea of private ownership, maybe tribal ownership, but not private. We also see religious differences. Native Americans, again, another big generalization, found harmony with nature and the spiritual world. And many different tribes, though they had varying beliefs, had a tendency to believe that all things in the universe depended on each other. They had ceremonies that honored their creator, different creators for each tribe. And many tribes recognized their own creator's work in everyday lives. Many Europeans were Christian. Actually, most Europeans were Christian. They did not trust the Native Americans because the natives weren't Christians. They feared the Native Americans to be evil. And they actually worked very hard to convert Native Americans. The Spanish were particularly successful. Even within the European groups, though, the French and the Spanish were mostly Catholic, whereas later the English were mostly Protestant. So we do see diversity there too. As European encroachments on Native American land and demands on their labor increased, Native people often defended themselves, maintained their political sovereignty, their economic prosperity, religious beliefs, and concepts of gender relations through diplomatic negotiations and later military resistance. So Native Americans didn't just convert to these new ideas that the Europeans brought in, they actually fought to preserve their own heritage. So we see the Spanish moving in with mission systems. This goes to the idea of religion. Spanish built missions throughout Texas and throughout New Spain. But in Texas in particular, there were Catholic, Dominican, Franciscan, and Jesuit outposts. These were basically conversion, I don't want to say churches, but they would serve the community, but they would often house different leaders, whether that be priests or friars or I can't think of the word. It'll come to me later. But men, particularly monks, who would convert the Native Americans to Christianity. And the Spanish mission system did successfully spread Christianity among Native Americans. It also, more importantly, gave Spain a foothold in the frontier land in the New World. We also see the Acoma War, and this is an example of military resistance. The Acoma War is also known as the defeat of the Pueblos. The important name that you need to remember from this is Juan de Oñate. In the early 20s, in his early 20s, Juan de Oñate led numerous campaigns and raids against the Chichimeque Indians on the frontier. Again, this is in northern New Spain. Oñate was an explorer and a conquistador. He started a Spanish colony in New Mexico. He was searching for mythical riches of North America, gold. In 1598, he actually governed New Mexico, and he was a very harsh leader to the Spanish settlers, and especially harsh to the Native Americans. In 1598, his military confronted the Acoma Indians, or Acoma Native Americans, and he demanded supplies. We assume it might have been winter, and the Spanish settlers did not have enough for the winter. The Native Americans resisted his demands, so this is an example of diplomatic resistance. And he and then turned military. They ended up killing 12 of Oñate's men. One was his nephew. In January of 1599, he begins a war. So again, military resistance. 800 Acoma Pueblo villagers were killed. 500 were imprisoned. Oñate sent the military to cut off the foot of every village man in the Acoma tribe from the ages of 12 to 25 to prevent them from fleeing or from retaliating against the Spanish. Oñate eventually retired and returned to Spain without finding gold. But that is really the end of major Pueblo resistance in New Spain. We also talk a lot in this class about extended contact with Native Americans and Africans that fostered debate amongst European religious and political leaders. So I'm going to talk about two leaders, philosophers, influential Spanish leaders who disagreed on how to treat the Native Americans. So how should Europeans treat non-Europeans? And how should they respect the religious, cultural, and racial tendencies or characteristics, and even subjugation of Africans and Native Americans. So here are two diverse viewpoints that we're going to talk about some more after this lecture. This man is Juan de Sepulveda. He was a Spanish humanist lawyer, he was a court chaplain, and he was a historian for Charles V. Juan de Sepulveda held a firm opinion, and this is in the 1550s. He thought that Indians had no ruler, that they were pre-social men, they did not deserve rights or property. Because they had no laws, they were actually inferior, and it was justifiable for the Spaniards to enslave Native Americans, and that's what he truly thought. He actually wrote a book called Democrates Alter, or translated, Just Cause for War Against the Indians, to support his viewpoint. Now, there was a man, a little bit younger, who disagreed with Juan de Sepulveda. His name was Bartolome de las Casas. He disagreed with Sepulveda, and Bartolome de las Casas' views actually were more accepted by the Spanish court than Sepulveda's. So, this is what de las Casas said. He was a Spanish historian and a Dominican missionary, and he was the first person to truly believe and write about and influence the king in Spain to oppose Spanish oppression of Native Americans and Africans. De las Casas called for an abolition of slavery in the Americas, and he called for just treatment of Native Americans and later Africans. So again, two diverse viewpoints. Please let me know if you have any questions.